21 February 1945 Iwo Jima. Wind off the sulphur sea pushes ash across the lip of Motoyama Airfield. No, 1 as an M, 4A, 3R5, creeps up a black slope. The Sherman's turret does not carry a gun that matters here. The weapon is the snouted projector, chained to tanks in the hull. Ahead, a concrete pillbox breathes through a slit and 2 narrow vents. Marines are on their bellies, marking the throat with red smoke, while a machine gun team saws short bursts to keep the opening blind. Above and offshore, Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet hums beyond the horizon. Closer, in Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's landing craft, still shuttle men and fuel. On the island, Major General Harry Schmidt's Amphibious Corps has pushed a finger past the runway. The job at this finger belongs to armor pooled from 4th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Richard K. Schmidt and 5th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel William R. Collins. Inside the hill sits Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's garrison, a web of rooms and galleries that run cold beneath the lava. Naval detachments loyal to Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimaru have cut firing lanes that show nothing until they open. When they do, they open in a flash. The Sherman halts. The bow gunner lifts the projector a fraction. The driver sets the nose. The tank commander's glove chops forward and the pump wakes like a heart. Flame goes out in a white roar, heavy and slow, a rope that bends on the wind and finds the vent. It folds inside. A cough answers from within the hill, a pressure thump that lifts dust from the roof. Fire comes back through the firing, slit orange first, then a color closer to metal. Marines move. One team sprints to the secondary exit and slaps a charge across the seam, while the tank paints the aperture in 2-second bursts. The charge punches. The vent exhales black. Above the runway, the noise falls away. Cans tick in the cooling air. The tank idles. No one cheers. Beneath the black stone, the tunnels are still there. But the fire has learned the way in. The island's value was not romantic. It sat midway on the airline, from the Marianas to Tokyo, a hard black triangle whose airfields could pull crippled B-29 seconds out of the ocean's mouth and later push fighters forward to cover raids. That is why the fleet came in under Admiral Raymond Spruance, why Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's transports emptied wave after wave into ash, and why Major General Harry Schmidt's Amphibious Corps drove a wedge past Motoyama's. Runways in February 1945. The airstrips were the prize. Every cave, mouth and pillbox was a lock on that prize. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood that brute volume would come for him. He built for it. His garrison cut galleries into the island's igneous ribs, wiring rooms, sapping cross corridors, tying firing points to vents and periscopes, and burying command posts deep enough that naval guns could pass over without payment. He forbade wasteful banzai charges and held his infantry to measured fire plans that opened only when Marines were inside killing distance. Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimaru's naval detachments stiffened strongpoints and kept machine guns and mortars stitched to the contours. When a pillbox died, its neighbours still lived. When a trench was taken, its roof hid another trench. Artillery and air struck for days before the landings and kept striking after. Bomb damage maps looked satisfying at standoff. Up close, Marines learned the surfaces were deceptive. A bunker's lip could be shattered without starving the room behind it. A cave could be choked with rubble and still breathe through a shaft 40 yards upslope. In that gap between what heavy fire could scar and what it could seal, lived the island's hardest problem: men underground who could keep watching, keep breathing, and keep firing after the barrages moved on. The Marine answer was procedural. Infantry fixed the opening. Engineers marked air intakes, feeling for the faint exhale that told of lungs below. Tanks were pooled as a service arm, summoned to a coordinate, and folded into a drill that had been worked out in the Central Pacific the hard way: isolate, ignite, seal. Portable flamethrowers had already proven the chemistry and the risk. Short legs, fragile carriers, catastrophic exposure in the last 10 yards. What the force needed on Iwo was the same effect with weight armor and sustained pressure. That is why the Shermans arrived with their guns subordinated to a different instrument. The projector in the bow spat a heavy stream that did not behave like spray. It clung. Napalm, thickened by powder and pushed by a pump, would roll over a parapet, pour through a vent, and keep burning where oxygen was richest. The tank could deliver that stream in measured bursts back clear and do it again, while a machine gun clipped the firing slit shut and engineers ran the last yards to chain a door or tamp a charge. If a vent lay around the shoulder of a hill, the vehicle's reach bent around the geometry. If a cave's mouth was too broad to close in one pass, the crew made more than one pass. The divisions pushing north, 3rd on the left, 4th on the right, 5th up the centre, had to eat the island one node at a time. They learned to speak in targets that barely had names: a mouth in a cut, a shadow 2 feet below an overhang, a gust of breath you could lose if the surf came in loud. Platoons carried smoke to colour inlets. Scouts crawled just far enough to see a seam line in poured concrete. The radioman called a tank, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the only tool that could push fire into whatever space Kuribayashi's engineers had protected from the sky. Lieutenant Colonel Richard K. Schmidt's 4th Tank Battalion and Lieutenant Colonel William R. Collins's 5th Tank Battalion rotated their flame vehicles like ambulances, answering points of friction, and then moving to the next grid square, where the advance had halted in front of another cold mouth. The stakes were measured every hour in 2 ledgers. One ledger tracked ground, taken a ridge whose Japanese name mattered less than its angle to the runway, a quarry whose spoil piles hid mortars that cut lanes through landing beaches, a blockhouse whose geometry controlled the only road, around a promontory. The other ledger tracked sorties and lives-saved bombers that would limp in from Honshu with engines out and wheels half frozen, and fighter squadrons that would need the island later as a springboard. Every bunker reduced accelerated those ledgers together. Every bunker left alive held both ledgers back. Kuribayashi's plan assumed American impatience. The Marines answered with method. The fleet kept the pressure ceiling low. The carriers under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher erased any daylight assembly above ground. The Corps pushed forward behind dozers that shaved the black soil into new approaches. Where gunfire peeled armor from concrete, it did. Where only heat would drive defenders out of holes they had studied for months. The Shermans wrote heat into the hill until the vents changed color and the exhaust turned black. It was not quick, and it was not clean. It was precise. The island would not be taken by momentum. It would be taken by finding every breath the tunnels took and teaching fire to follow it. The black crust of Iwo Jima hid a kind of geometry. Everything that could kill was dug, poured, or welded into a shape that exploited that stone. Kuribayashi's engineers learned early that basalt could not be broken easily, but could be carved, and they carved it with a mathematician's patience: pits, shafts, and firing ports, spaced so no weapon could silence more than one at a time. In those galleries, the Japanese 145th Infantry Regiment kept air moving with fans powered by hand and turned waste shafts into firing positions. Each opening was a mouth that could breathe fire or inhale it, depending on who learned the angles first. When the Marines reached those mouths, conventional shells made only noise. The 75mm guns of their Shermans could punch holes through bunker lips, but behind that first cavity there was usually another wall or an elbow that turned the blast aside. It was not a failure of gunnery, it was physics meeting design. So the engineers and tank crews began measuring lethality in seconds of heat, not calibers. The M4A 3R5 was born from that need. On paper it weighed 33 tons and carried the same Ford V8 as any Sherman. But where the cannon's recoil cylinder had been, there was a different system. Twin cylinders feeding pressurized napalm through an auxiliary pump rated at roughly 250 pounds per square inch. The liquid gasoline thickened with aluminum soaps could be fired in sustained bursts of 8 to 10 seconds, or in quick pulses, each carrying about 15 gallons. The range in clear air and no wind stretched past 130 yards. Crews called it a river that obeyed orders. Inside the tank, the smell was always part fuel, part fear. The driver watched the gauge because pressure spikes meant a valve was seizing, and a valve seizing meant a backfire that could ignite the tank itself. The gunner worked behind a screen of narrow glass, smeared with soot. He saw the world in fragments, slit flame smoke, slit again. The commander, standing half out of the cupola, was the only man who saw the entire exchange. He gave range, told when to cut the stream, when to angle low to make the napalm crawl. Japanese defenders learned the sound of the pumps, the whine that rose just before ignition, and some tried to time their counterfire to it. Light mortars dropped rounds blind over their own roofs. Machine guns raked in arcs too wide to aim, but the flame outran them. It behaved like fluid until it met oxygen, then became something else entirely. When it struck a vent, the liquid drained down. The first man it touched never had time to move. When it filled a room, the oxygen disappeared faster than skin could burn. Men collapsed before they screamed. For those who survived the initial blast, carbon monoxide did the rest. The terrain turned every calculation into improvisation. Basalt slopes threw heat back at the tanks, so crews often had to reverse quickly after a long burst to avoid baking their own radiators. The tunnels ran so deep that the first application of fire sometimes changed nothing. Minutes later, pressure built, and a secondary vent would erupt 50 yards away, a belch of black smoke marking where the heat had reached. Marines learned to watch for that sign, the delayed exhale, and move immediately because the defenders who survived sometimes emerged through that same hole burned but still armed. The 4th and 5th Tank Battalions treated their flame vehicles as shared instruments. A single Zippo, as the Marines called them, could work a sector for hours, moving under infantry cover, burning, retreating to refill, then returning. Refueling was its own kind of battle. Drums of napalm were winched from landing craft and mixed by hand on the beach, the air stinking of solvent and gasoline. Ground crews wore asbestos gloves that turned black by noon. Every gallon moved forward under sniper fire. Every refill carried the risk of a spark. Compared to the portable flamethrowers slung on a man's back, these machines were almost serene. The M2S had a combat life measured in seconds, 15 seconds of flame, and if lucky, one more tank. 90% of operators in the first days were hit before they could make their second pass. The tanks, by contrast, could stay online as long as fuel and pressure held. They did not feel fear, though the men inside did. Kuribayashi's defense depended on psychology as much as structure. His men had been told the Americans would never crawl into the fire, that a nation raised in comfort could not endure the taste of its own weapons. When the flamethrower tanks arrived, that belief corroded. The first bunkers to melt were manned by veterans of Saipan and Tinian men who had seen the older, shorter-range weapons. They expected to wait out the flame. Instead, they heard it continue past what physics should have allowed, 10 seconds, 20 a minute of continuous pressure. The heat, soaked through concrete and armor plate, found trapped air behind bulkheads and turned the bunkers themselves into chimneys. From the American side, progress looked methodical. A battalion would advance 100 yards a day, its tanks always near the front, each shot of flame coordinated by voice and hand signal. Infantry would follow in the smoke, checking every aperture with grenades, plugging openings with sandbags or demolitions. Behind them, bulldozers closed what the tanks had cleared. The battlefield changed color grey to red, red to black, then back to grey ash as the next wave of shellfire rolled in. There were failures. Some Shermans bogged in soft ash. Their tracks spun, their flame jets arced too high, exposing them to anti-tank guns hidden in embrasures. A hit on the fuel line could turn the vehicle into a furnace. Crews knew it. One tank of the 4th Battalion was pierced through the glacis by a 47mm shell. The pressure tank ignited, and the vehicle became the weapon it had carried, burning for 20 minutes before collapsing in its own crater. The survivors called it internal napalm. Yet even these losses served the logic of the operation. Each destroyed tank revealed another rule about range, angle, or ventilation. Reports went up the chain nightly. How far a burst could penetrate, how long before a vent's exhaust went black, how much pressure to sustain before retreating. It was science done under fire. By March, the pattern was visible even to the men underground. The flame tanks would arrive without warning, but every visit ended the same way. A rise in temperature, a thunderclap inside the hill, silence, then the smell of tar. Japanese survivors wrote later that the heat was not the worst part. It was the sound, the slow exhale that came before ignition, like a lung drawing in. That was when they understood that the island's defences were no longer impervious. Concrete, steel, and stone could survive high explosives. They could not survive sustained fire that crawled like a living thing. When the airfield's northern edge finally fell, it was not because of a single heroic charge or a decisive bombardment. It was because the chemistry of napalm, the mechanics of the pump, and the discipline of the men who drove those Shermans had made a new equation. The defenders' strength, depth, stone silence, had become the medium in which they were consumed. On Iwo Jima, the physics of war changed from impact to infusion. The heat did not strike, it entered, and once inside it stayed. The tank's interior smelled like hot paint and damp canvas, a moving room the color of worn brass. The driver watched the pressure gauge for the projector more than the tachometer. The needle trembled when the pump primed, then steadied when the line filled. The commander stood half out of the cupola to catch the hand signals from the infantry, one glove on the rim, the other tapping the gunner's shoulder to set the burst length. Outside, ash drifted sideways across the nose and hissed under the tracks. They were working the north edge of Motoyama Airfield. No one where the ground looked flat until it rose, and every rise had a mouth. Infantry led them in with smoke. A corporal pointed with 2 fingers, not at a door, but at a seam where concrete met volcanic rock. The machine gun in the bow stitched short to hold the slit quiet. Then the projector lifted a degree, barely a breath, and the pump came alive. The stream left the tank like a heavy rope. The driver counted. 2 seconds cut. 3 seconds cut. The commander listened for the change, because there was always a change when heat made the vent into a chimney. The first exhale turned the smoke from grey to black. Engineers were already moving their satchels, knocking against their hips, fuses coiled under their chins to keep them dry. No one shouted. Shouting wasted the little air you kept under your helmet. Under that same ground, a private in Kuribayashi's garrison pressed his palm to the wall to feel what the room could not yet tell him. The bunker had been cool at dawn. By noon it had grown close, the kind of closeness that made men fight over a water bottle, not because they were thirsty, but because swallowing gave them something to do. He sat near the hand-cranked fan and watched the man on the handle count revolutions. 30 turns, a pause, 30 turns. The sergeant had made a point of it no noise unless there was a reason. Smoke came down shafts when fans ran too hard. He could not see the outside. He saw only the slit, and the slit saw only a triangle of ash and wind. The breath of the bunker was a thing you felt on the back of your hand. The first hint was not heat or light. It was a tone. A thin whine, like a belt slipping under load, rising faster than the ear expected, and then flattening as if it had found the note it wanted. The private looked at the sergeant. The sergeant did not look back. He was laying a line of tracer next to the mouth, not at it. That was another rule fire beside the opening to steal the enemy's aim without telling him where your barrel was. Mortarmen behind the partition dropped 2 rounds blind toward the slope. The shells went out into brightness and didn't change anything. The wine drew breath. The private tasted something metallic and sweet at once, the way a nail tastes after you hold it too long in your teeth. Up top, the tank backed half a length to avoid its own reflection of heat. The driver felt warmth through the soles of his boots, even with the plates between them and the earth. The commander raised his hand again, this time a flat palm circling twice. Long burst. The gunner squeezed. Fire left the mouth in a pulse that looked slow to the eye and felt fast to the skin. Napalm folded down the vent like syrup, finding a crack in a table. The machine gun cut for a heartbeat and came back on. An engineer sprinted to a secondary slot and slapped a charge along the seam fingers, pinching the fuse and folding it back with a practiced flick to shorten the delay. Inside the room the colour changed. The private knew that before his eyes told him. Air turned heavy in his throat and then left altogether. The colour came after orange, where oil had filmed the concrete near the slit, then a low red near the floor. The fan stopped because the man on the handle had let go without meaning to. The sergeant tried to speak and made only a sound at the start of a word. Men further in the gallery moved toward the back corridor, where a shaft ran up to a second firing point. They had rehearsed that move. It was the way out when the first room died. But the shaft was already breathing wrong. A soft noise came down it like a sheet pulled across a bed. Someone coughed and kept coughing without breath to feed it. The private felt his knees touch the floor without deciding to kneel. On the surface, infantry tasted grit between their teeth when the secondary blew. They stepped out of the blast shadow with rifles up, because sometimes the heat pushed men out instead of holding them in. 2 forms fell through the low door and lay still enough that no one fired. A third came half out and tried to lift a weapon. A Marine shot once and moved past because time was always shorter than you thought. The engineer's hand found the tank's skirt and knocked twice the signal to paint again. The gunner counted this time without numbers, the way a cook counts when he salts. Flame ate the opening to dull red. When it went black around the edges, the commander cut and waved off. At Turkey Knob, the ground rose into a hard shoulder of rock that had not moved since the island was new. The approach was a yard at a time. Dozers shaved and built the yard. Tanks used it. Men lay on it and became part of it when the angle flattened them to the stone. An infantry lieutenant used his radio as a telescope because the glass was clean and he could look down the hill without raising his head above the skyline. He called for 1 tank by number, not because the number mattered, but because it made the request specific. The reply was not words so much as a shift in engine noise. Vehicles talk to each other, whether they want to or not. The driver who had been watching pressure now watched temperature. The power plant ran hot in ash. He opened the hatch a crack to let a blade of cold in and closed it because the cold came with grit. The loader, who had almost nothing to do in a flame tank when the main gun slept, used his hands instead to count the drum level by weight. He could tell within a gallon how much was left by the way the tank felt when it pivoted. They were nearly dry. The commander did the math: time to burn again, time to reverse, time to refill from the beach, time to return, before the infantry's line lost the little shade it had. None of those times were long. Far below, in a gallery that tied into Hill 382, a sailor from Rear Admiral Toshinosuke, Ichimaru's detachment lay on a cot that had been chosen because it was near the fan. He had not slept. He had spent the night sharpening a bayonet, not because it needed it, but because the scrape of steel meant he still made decisions. He had not seen the enemy, only the shapes the enemy made, the shade when a tank passed the dust when a charge went off. He was a machine gunner by role and a messenger by need. When the shaft breathed wrong, he was the man who ran to the next room to tell the others to seal the door between compartments. He practiced the message in his head, so he would not waste breath on the way. When he touched the handle of the steel door, heat came through like an order. He kept his hands on the cooler edges and pushed. The hinges squealed in a frequency that made his teeth hurt. From behind him came a sound his mother would have called wind. It was not wind. It was oxygen leaving. On the surface, an engineer from the 5th Marine Division slid a shaped charge into a mouth that had stopped spitting. He could feel the tank at his back more than he heard it. The vehicle's mass filled the space between his shoulder blades and the island. He knew the crew inside by tasks and glances, not by names. The commander's eyes were always looking past him. The gunner's eyes looked at the exact square inch where napalm ended and stone began. The driver's eyes never left the gauge cluster, except when the tank rocked. The engineer had learned to trust those eyes because they did not make promises. When the fuse curled under his thumb and burned down to nothing, he stepped away and the doorway turned into coarse dust. Somewhere under the slope, air changed direction again. Refueling at the beach was another war. Drums of thickened gasoline rolled out of nets and into sand, still littered with shrapnel. Mechanics mixed powder into fuel with paddles the size of oars and poured it through strainers that clogged no matter how careful they were. A sergeant from the 4th Tank Battalion checked for sparks with his hands because he could not hear anything but engines and surf. The smell of solvent made lunch taste like cloth. When the tank that needed the fuel reached the line, the hose went in, and the world narrowed to a rubber mouth and a ground wire. Men moved slower than their thoughts, because haste had lit enough men on fire already. Below the ground, the private who had pressed his palm to the wall lay with his cheek on the same stone. It was cool again where he touched it. The fan had not moved in minutes. He could not tell if the room was empty because he could not lift his head to look. He felt the door to the secondary chamber shake once, as if someone had leaned on it and then settle. He thought of the drill they had practiced moving from room to room like water along channels. The drill had brought them here. The heat had found them here. He did not try to stand. The tank came back up from the beach heavier and cleaner, the way a man looks after he has washed his face and eaten. The commander climbed back into the cupola and looked where the line had been and where it was now. He did not measure yards. He measured mouths. The infantry had plugged 2 and marked 3. The dozer had shaved a lane that would let the vehicle angle low at a new seam. The radio said little. The island said less. They moved again because movement was the work. The projector would light and cut and light again until the gauge said empty. The crews would count in seconds, because seconds were the units that mattered. Below men would count turns of a handle until the handle stopped turning. The airfields would grow wider, not by proclamation, but by the absence of places from which bullets came. On a map somewhere, arrows would make that look simple. In the tank and in the tunnel, it was only breath kept lost, stolen, or burned. Doctrine followed the terrain. The island stone forced a method that was neither glamorous nor quick: isolate a point, inject heat into it, and deny it breath. That sequence did not emerge fully formed. It was built out of reports, field modifications, and a chain of decisions that began far from the beach and ended at a vent the size of a helmet rim. Before the landings, marine schools and fleet staff had already accepted that caves were not a sideline problem in the Central Pacific. Saipan and Tinian had made that plain. Portable flamethrowers proved the chemistry, but the casualty sheets told a second story about exposure and reach. The Chemical Warfare Service in Pacific Ocean areas worked with Seabees and ordnance personnel to move the flame from a man's back into a vehicle that could carry pressure, fuel, and armor. The result in the Marianas was a cluster of workable conversions. By February 1945, the design had hardened into a kit with standard tanks, pumps, igniters, and controls that a maintenance section could install and keep running in the ash. The choice to ship those kits forward and dedicate scarce hulls to carry them was a production decision that channeled directly into tactics. Once ash replaced water under the tracks, the question became how to get the most heat into the least safe space with the fewest dead men. The answer was pooling. Flame tanks were not assigned permanently to a single rifle unit. They were held at battalion level and dispatched like a service called to a grid, folded into someone else's problem, and then sent on. Radio nets were kept simple. Infantry platoons signaled a target with smoke and hand. Engineers marked air and exhaust, and the tank commander listened for a frequency that only mattered for the minute he was there. That kept response times short and prevented any one sector from hoarding the only tool that could push fire around corners. At the point of contact, the drill reduced to roles that were not negotiable. Infantry owned the approach and the immediate flanks because the projector's field of view was narrow and every slit outside that view was the enemy's opportunity. Engineers owned the vents because heat without ceiling was a breath, followed by a sigh and then a gunshot from behind you. The tank owned the seconds. The pump could sustain a rope of napalm long enough to change the air in a room, but not forever. The crew had to count the burst, listen for the note that meant the target had transitioned from space to chimney, and stop before reflection cooked the tank itself. Bulldozers trailed close to turn success into something the next squad could stand on. No piece of the sequence mattered if it did not collapse a position, hold the collapse, and make a lane wide enough for a stretcher or a resupply run. The staff problem looked different and had its own arithmetic. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's beachmasters fought the clock of surf and tide to keep drums of thickener and gasoline moving from holds to sand. Chemical sections measured output like a factory drums mixed per hour strainers, cleared per shift. Hose couplings replaced before failure. Marine Division staff arranged their day around the flame fleet's capacity. A rifle regiment could push faster than the tanks could refill. Pushing faster without heat meant walking into mouths that had already proven they could outlast high explosive. The compromise was to stage the battalion-sized advances around the refuel cycle and keep a reserve of flame vehicles free to answer an unexpected holdout that, if left ungelded, could rake a company's flank after it passed. It was not a pure land problem. The carriers of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher erased any daytime assembly above ground. Naval gunfire drew lines on the map where the tanks were allowed to work without concussion, lifting them off the slope. Liaison officers rode tank decks with field telephones to the engine room of a destroyer, sitting just far enough offshore that she could drop a string of shells across a ridge and then pull it back like a curtain. That coordination mattered most when a tank bogged or took a hit. A single 47mm gun hidden in an embrasure could cut open a flame vehicle before its crew even knew the angle existed. When that happened, everyone had about the length of one breath to decide whether to extract the crew, silence the gun with heat, or break contact, and plaster the embrasure from the sea. Those choices were made easier by the fact that the organization had already agreed on an order of work: save crews, if it can be done under cover, kill guns if the crews are already gone, and accept the delay if neither is possible without paying twice. The defense's logic was coherent and did not depend on courage alone. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's order against wasteful charges preserved ammunition and men for the geometry he had built. The strongest points were tied to a grid of alternate exits and fighting positions that were manned only when needed. That robbed the attackers of targets that could be reduced by routine and forced them to expose the tools they valued most to kill a thing that remained unseen. But the same geometry also created a vulnerability that fires exploited. A chamber that shared air with a second chamber could be survived under blast. Men moved after the shell landed. A chamber that shared air with a shaft would not be survived under flame. Men fell where they sat. The defenders adapted where they could, closing apertures with wet mats, moving ammunition away from vents, setting offset positions to fire across a burning mouth rather than through it. But every adaptation cost time or visibility, or both. The doctrine that began as denial eventually demanded evacuation under conditions that gave the Americans the next decision as well. Decision-making at division and corps level reflected those realities. Major General Harry Schmidt and his division commanders did not order dramatic maneuvers because the island would not support them. They ordered economies. Reserve flame tanks were never committed all at once. Rapid advances were avoided if the flame pool could not support them. Engineers were tied doctrinally to tank companies rather than borrowed ad hoc when convenient. Reports went up every evening. They were not rhetorical. They recorded how many vents had been found by sight versus touch, how many bursts were needed to silence a given volume of space, how long after a burn the secondary vent exhaled, and whether sealing was effective the first time. Those reports drove the next morning's allocations. A sector with more air movement received more tanks. A sector with thin ash that swallowed hulls received more dozers and fewer flame sorties until a road could be built. Industrial reach framed the whole effort. The kits and spares that made those conversions function came from far beyond the volcano islands. The thickener itself arrived in bags that had to stay dry on beaches that could not promise dry. Pumps failed, and were replaced from boxes packed months earlier at depots that were thinking in tonnage, not in vents. Ordnance units carried igniter cartridges in tins that rusted if you looked at them wrong. The fact that a tank at Motoyama could burn a shaft on call depended on a string of mundane acts from a crane operator who lifted a case without dropping it to a supply clerk who insisted the wrong gasket would not do. There is no romance in a gasket that fits. There is certainty, and certainty is what lets a crewman lay his hand on a lever and expect flame rather than silence. It would be easy to turn that reliability into a hymn about scale, but scale alone does not tell you where to point a nozzle. The practical excellence of the method came from a blend of improvisation and discipline. Crews swapped observations across battalions as readily as they swapped hoses. An ignition break that had been solved with a field-made spacer in one company showed up 2 days later, bolted neatly into the plumbing of another. Infantry leaders discovered that smoke color could be red for depth. White that lingered meant steam from wet basalt. Brown-black that boiled meant organic grime and fuel. Clean black that mounted quickly meant oxygen was burning somewhere other than the mouth. Engineers learned to lay charges in shapes that matched the odd mouths of igneous rock rather than the rectangles they had trained on in schoolhouses. None of this required permission from a map. It required an agreement among professionals that the shortest path between a lesson and a result was a single night. Not every position needed the same medicine. Some caves were too broad to fill without staggering bursts. Some mouths were set in such a way that any approach exposed the belly of a tank to a line of fire that could not be suppressed. The doctrine flexed around those facts instead of ignoring them. If a cave could not be burned from the front, sappers cut a side window with shaped charges while naval guns kept the neighborhood's heads down. If ash trapped the tank, dozers built a shelf, and if there was no time to build a shelf, the attack paused because the refill cycle on the beach did not care about anyone's momentum. Where portable flamethrowers could do a job with less risk, trench lines, shallow scrapes, brush they did, and tank fuel stayed for the mouths that had to be fed hot and deep. The defenders responded with stubborn professionalism. Machine gunners learned to rake ahead of the flame rather than at it, hoping to catch the men who always had to move inside the zone of heat to seal the work. Mortarmen cut their charge to drop blind rounds behind the tanks where infantry bunched. Anti-armor crews husbanded ammunition and refused tempting shots unless the angle promised more than a scratch. The battle between method and counter-method rarely produced spectacle. It produced adjustments counted in degrees and seconds. All of this served a single purpose, measured beyond the slope. Every bunker, reduced by heat, made an airstrip more usable for a bomber that would not swim on its way back from Honshu, or a fighter that would not ditch after escorting. That strategic logic did not require the men at the mouth to think about Tokyo. It required them to do the job in front of them in a way that left fewer jobs tomorrow. When the ground ledger and the air ledger advanced together, the method was working. When either stalled, the nightly reports changed, and the allocations changed with them. By March, the language of the operation had become plain even to men who did not speak English. A certain whine meant the pump was ready. A certain cough meant the vent had accepted its dose. A certain black meant the air had left a room and would not come back. There were still corners where Stone and Will held longer than anyone predicted, and there were still days when the cycle broke and a tank burned on the wrong side of the battle. But the sum of choices held. The staff refused to spend lives faster than fuel. The crews refused to outrun their engineers. The engineers refused to declare a position dead until they had felt it stop breathing with their hands. In the end, there was no single order that unlocked the island, no flourish that made the vents surrender. There was a logic that moved from the factory to the beach to the mouth, and then inside the mouth to the last pocket of air. Heat replaced blast as the language of reduction, and once everybody learned to speak it, stone stopped being a refuge and became a conduit. The hill did not fall to shock. It yielded to procedure that burned its way in and closed the door behind it. They had built their faith from stone. The galleries under Iwo Jima were not a superstition. They were arithmetic depth plus concrete plus vents equaled survival. Men learned to ignore concussion and trust the angle of a passageway, the way a wall turned a blast aside. That faith carried them through bombardments that shook cups off hooks and still left rifles on their racks. It was the thing a corporal told a new man when the earth started to hum: hold your place, wait for the thunder to pass, breathe through the cloth, and listen for orders. Then February gave them a sound they had not trained for, a mechanical rising note that did not end in impact. It ended in breath leaving. The myth cracked first at places too small for maps, an air shaft above a nameless room, a slit that looked like a crack until it glowed. A crew heard the pump, felt the walls warm, as if the hill had pulled a blanket over its own face, and discovered that waiting out pressure meant inviting heat. A sergeant who had survived Saipan told his section to sit deeper against the back wall. The air left there first. He learned that the safe corner was the most lethal space because the flame consumed oxygen before it licked the floor. He did not repeat that lesson. Word moved the way word always moves in war, by rumor and by the example of men who no longer spoke. The first reports that traveled the galleries said the Americans had a longer flamethrower. The second said the Americans had found the vents. The third stopped arguing about the tool and discussed the method. It was the method that unstitched the belief that any bunker could be waited out. The flame did not need to touch skin to end the fight. It needed to make air into something that lungs could not use. You could point a machine gun at a mouth and still be beaten by chemistry occurring down a tunnel you had never seen. On the surface, Marines reached the same conclusion from the other side. They had watched explosives scour concrete without erasing the room behind it. They had seen pillboxes that would not die collect kills all afternoon and then wake again at dawn. Now they saw mouths change color and stay changed. They saw men run out, not with rifles up, but with arms slack and faces turned away from light. Platoon leaders stopped asking whether a position was reduced and started asking whether it still breathed. Engineers learned to place a palm against the rock after a burn and feel the direction of the draft. If the draft reversed, they sealed. If it did not, they called the tank back and burned until it did. Hill 382 taught that lesson in the plainest way. The shoulders of that ground had so many mouths that counting them felt like superstition. The first days there looked like stalemate by inches, the sort of fight that breeds a story about an island too stubborn to move. Then the flame tanks worked a circuit that looked uninspired on paper and felt decisive underfoot. They never chased men. They chased air. When one vent coughed black, the crews and engineers pivoted to the next, ignoring rifle fire that could not change the equation. By mid-afternoon the ridge was not cleared. It was emptied, a different thing. The positions still stood, and still held their geometry. They no longer contained living men. Inside, the defense officers who had repeated Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's no-charge order began moving units forward, only to pull them back through ports, cut for that purpose, discovering that movement itself pulled fire, into the new chambers. A room that had been safe at dawn became a chimney at noon because someone had opened a door in the wrong order. A naval detachment under Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimaru shifted machine guns to rake across mouths from offset angles. It worked until the tanks and rifles declined to contest the slit and aimed instead for the quiet pipe up the slope. An artilleryman who had hidden his tubes behind a fold discovered that the fold fed a shaft. He kept his guns there and burned with them. The countermeasures were courageous and sometimes clever. Wet mats over vents shaved seconds from the burn. Ammunition piled away from obvious openings reduced secondary detonations. Mortars, when set to drop blind behind tanks, punished the infantry who had to seal the job at pistol range. But the logic no longer ran through courage. It ran through air. Every adaptation that preserved sight lines exposed breath, and every adaptation that preserved breath reduced sight. That is what collapse looks like in a system designed by thoughtful men, not a rout, not a cry, but the convergence of choices on a single variable you cannot protect. Marines noticed the change in how quiet things grew after each burn. Early on they braced for counterfire at the minute mark and got it. Later, the marksmen who waited to catch a tank commander in his cupola found themselves aiming at heat haze and nothing behind it. The line stopped asking for barrage to be held while they closed. They asked for silence, and silence arrived on schedule because the only mouths that could object had been taught to inhale flame. A lieutenant who once framed his map with arrows started penciling circles around vents and crossing them out one at a time. He told a replacement that progress would look like a widening patch of ground where there were no smells left but tar and cordite. In the galleries, the recognition hardened into a sentence men said without ceremony. A senior NCO burned along one arm and still posted near a fan told a runner, "We cannot stop their fire from breathing." It was not a cry of defeat. It was a report. It spread because it matched what men felt in their throats. Another line joined it in notes that never reached a headquarters. "We are not the monsters now." The myth had been that the underground made them inhuman, untouchable patient more stone than blood. The new truth was that the stone served the enemy's method. The advantage that made them fearsome had been turned into a conduit that made them fragile. Tank crews absorbed a different humility at the same moment. They had come to despise the way ash ate filters, and the way heat reflected from basalt made a burst feel like sin. By March, they understood that the thing they carried was not spectacle but grammar. A projector, a pump, a counting of seconds, an engineer's hand on a seam. These were clauses in a language that the island answered with darkness and then surrendering air. When a crew lost a vehicle to a hidden gun and watched their own tank become a torch, they did not change the sentence. They refined the timing of the next one. That persistence is banal when described and terrible when lived. It is also how myths end. There was a day on Motoyama's northern edge when the wind went slack and the island seemed to hold its breath with the men. A Sherman edged forward gave the long burst that crews had learned to trust when vents were shallow and cut. The engineer moved, sealed, and stepped back. No one spoke. The tank idled. A minute later, the secondary shaft exhaled a thin black that curled and faded. The line shifted up 5 yards without a shot fired. It felt like theft. It felt like science. It felt like the conclusion of an argument that had been going on since the first Marine saw a cave on a map and someone in a staff tent said, "We will need heat." In the notes that followed, there were no declarations. There were counts, vents reduced, bursts expended, hulls, lost rooms that did not reopen. The defenders still wrote orders that used words like hold and deny. They still fought with precision when given a chance to fire from a slit across a lane the Americans had to cross. But the places from which they could make those precise shots dwindled faster than replacements arrived. The myth cannot survive arithmetic that does not favor it. Stone and will and training met a sequence that converted them into fuel. When the island's center line finally belonged to the men on top of it, no one claimed revelation. The commanders did not announce that a doctrine had been vindicated. The crews did not become the story. The story was that airfields needed mouths to be closed, and that the only reliable way to close them was heat delivered by procedure. The garrison under Kuribayashi had made the hill a fortress. The fortress did not fall. It emptied. A Marine set his hand to rock after the last burn of the day and waited for the faint draught he had learned to trust. Nothing moved against his palm. He looked at the engineer beside him and did not nod. There was no need. The island gave up another breath it would not get back. By the time the runways stretched clean across the island, the work had already done the thing it was meant to do. Crews on the Marianas flew home with cylinders shaking and fuel gauges dishonest, and the black triangle on the chart became a place where heavy bombers could drop in one engine short and still roll to a stop. Fighter groups staged closer to Japan and spent their minutes over target instead of in transit. None of that depended on speeches. It depended on mouths in stone that no longer breathed. The legacy on the ground was procedural. Operations orders after February wrote heat into reduction tables the way they once wrote blast and battalion schedules, were drawn against the refuel cycle of flame tanks as surely as they were drawn against tides. Engineers came away with a new habit of finding air first and concrete second. Armor officers rewrote checklists, so a pump's tone mattered as much as oil pressure. Infantry leaders learned to measure a day's work in vents closed, not yards alone. The lesson was not romance. It was sequence. For the defenders, the aftertaste ran through memory and notes rather than new positions. The judgment they had trusted that depth and geometry would turn the island into an abacus of casualties paid out on American impatience did not hold. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's order that forbade waste made sense in a world of concussion and fragments. It could not reverse a chemistry that removed air from rooms without moving earth. The galleries that endured bombardment did not fail from collapse. They emptied, and emptiness is a form of defeat that leaves little to salvage. There is room for argument inside the results that followed. If the flame tanks had been more numerous earlier in the Central Pacific, would the pace of bunker reduction on hard islands have changed by weeks or only days? If chemical sections had been forced to ration thickener on wet beaches, would commanders have leaned back toward demolition and paid for it with men instead of fuel? If defenders had cut vents deeper and offset their mouths, could they have traded sight for breath and lived longer, or was the trade itself the trap? These questions sit in the margins of reports that record bursts expended and shafts sealed, and they are worth asking because they keep the lesson technical rather than mythic. What endures is the narrowness of the tool and the breadth of its effect. A flamethrower tank is a specialized machine with a short list of answers. On the right terrain, that short list solved problems that high explosives could not. The crews who counted seconds under ash did not claim they had found a universal key. They found a key for a lock made of stone, air, and discipline, and they used it until the tumblers stopped moving. The island's airfields became lanes that pointed forward, and planes used them. The tunnels remained underfoot as the men on top stepped over sealed mouths and walked out to lines of pierced steel planking that hummed in the heat. Night brought its own work: refuel, replace igniters, clean filters, send the day's numbers up the chain, and morning reset the arithmetic. There were no declarations about a war turned by fire. There were only check marks on vents that would not open again. Next comes another hill line cut for defense, and studied for months another place where stone and will claim priority. The question is whether the grammar learned here find the breath, feed it, heat, close the door, still holds when the slopes are longer, the rains heavier, and the galleries more cunning. The men who will test that are already mixing fuel in drums and counting seconds in their hands. The island behind them is quiet. It has run out of air,